So we're now starting part 2 of our introduction into the poetry section. This is for our Christian formation series on the book of Job. So just to catch those here up and those listening online up, last week we ended at what I think is a fairly appropriate section. We ended in Job chapter 19 with Job's response to his friend Bildad. So this is in the second round of Job's friends and their arguments about what Job is going through and Job's responses to them. So we had Job's response to Bildad, and we ended at the very end of that section, and in chapter 19, verse 25, we've got, "For I know my Redeemer lives." And again, the idea there, Ga'al, the Hebrew word for Redeemer, can also be deliverer. The idea is that this is the person who would have righted a wrong against you. And in this, we see one that it seems the implication here is that from Job's talking about his loneliness before, is that he's looking for a divine advocate. So kind of pointing us back to the divine drama that's been going on in the beginning in the prose section for Job. And then we also talked about the parallels that we see here with Jesus, that we know that we have our Redeemer and that he lives because it's Jesus Christ. And that also kind of points to something we'll likely be talking about later, that really kind of what we get here is the suffering of someone who's innocent, if we're to believe Job. And based on what we've gotten before in the book, I think we should. So we've got Job, who's an innocent, who is suffering and is looking for God's answer for why, and also is looking for comfort. And so a lot of this kind of gets at, well, a lot of this just gets at suffering in general, but specifically we get at the suffering in a world without Jesus, or rather before Jesus. So I think that kind of changes some of the arguments and the way we look at these things too. So, that said, we're going to move on to the last of Job's friends for the second argument. So those of you looking at this online, this should be the first thing that you see for those here from last week looking at our sheet from then. This will be on number 12, so I think this is on the third page for that. And so Zophar's second argument covers chapter 20, and again, the nice thing about Job is sometimes we'll get arguments that cover more than one chapter, but they're always divided evenly in chapters, so you're always going to end an argument at the end of a chapter, so which is nice. So all of chapter 20 in Job is Zophar's second argument. The basic bit of this argument, basically what Zophar's saying, summarized in a sentence, is that those who have wronged others will suffer. So basically, the ones who are suffering are the ones who must have done something wrong to someone. So again, sort of the argument that Job has to be at fault because he's suffering. And if you suffer, you have to have done something wrong. I would say that this raises the question, though. Then why are the victims suffering? So if we say that someone who suffers has done wrong to someone else, why did that person that the bad person wronged, why did they have to suffer? So I think that's an important question for us to ask. And it's one, interestingly enough, that doesn't really get raised in the main part of the text, at least. And it's which is kind of puzzling and strange. And I think Job could have gotten some points if he said, well, you say this, but what about the victims? Why did they have to suffer in the first place? And the only thing I want to note in particular here is chapter 20, verse 3. So Zophar says, I hear censure that insults me, and this is the important part, and a spirit beyond my understanding answers me. The claim there being that maybe Zophar is speaking through the Spirit. We might want to question that, considering what he says. But also that, again, gets back at this notion that there's something divine going on. So our causes me to answer is you can see. Yeah, so I think that just like emphasizes that translation emphasizes that it's the Spirit who's instigating this, that the Spirit is behind the answer. Which, that's something we talk about today, particularly with the Holy Spirit. But I think you have to wonder which spirit is making him talk, because we do have this divine court going on. There's a divinity that we're not seeing in the poetry section as much in the prose section that's going on and affecting things. So then we move on into Job chapter 21, whole chapter again. And so boiling down his argument to Zophar, it's basically, if what Zophar has said is true, then why do the wicked go unpunished? Which is also a good question to ask. And we'll be coming back to this as we get to the end of the poetry section. It is a good question to ask. Why do we see the wicked go unpunished? Or in our context now in 2017, why do celebrities and other famous and rich Hollywood and other folks get away with it for so long? Like thinking about Weinstein, why do the wicked go unpunished for so long too? One thing to particularly note in chapter 21, verses 20 and 21, and I'll go ahead and read that. Let their own eyes see their destruction. Let them drink of the wrath of the Almighty. For what do they care for their household after them, when the number of their months is cut off? So months, not mouths, there, as I almost said. This is, by the way, from the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, just as a note. So Job's point here, which I think is a good one and an interesting one, in other parts of Scripture, particularly in Torah, there's the idea that the sins of the fathers will get passed on and all that. And I think oftentimes we'll look at that and think, oh no, like we can't, we shouldn't do anything wrong because then our kids will get affected by it, which in a sense is true, because the effects of sin in the world. So yes, the things we do will impact what our children face. But I think Job has a good point here, is if somebody's really wicked, what are they going to care if what they do affects their children? Because it's not going to affect them. They're going to be long dead before this has any effect on anyone else. So, I think it's a good point that he makes, and makes us a little more mindful of maybe where wicked people are actually going to be coming from and actually going to be thinking. So that's the end of the round of second arguments. And so now we get into the final round of arguments from Job's three main friends. So Eliphaz is the first one up, again, as always. And so he starts us out with the third round of arguments. And this starts in Job chapter 22. In chapter 22. And the basic argument there is that basically Job needs to get himself right with God. And if he can do that first, then all is going to be well. Which, again, isn't really much different from what's being said before. A lot of the arguments are repetitive for each of the friends and all of the friends together. I mean, they're more or less saying the same thing that, well, if you're bad, then bad things happen to you. And then we get Job's response, which covers chapters 23 and 24. And summing this up, there's a lot going on here, so this will be more than one sentence this time, is that Job still needs to know what he's doing wrong. That's been his question before. It's his question again. Job also, we get more of a sense in this particular part that he needs to know that God is there and that God sees him. And that he still goes on from his last response and talks about still seeing the wicked doing bad things and getting away with it. Although that is interesting too, because we do get to a point in this, in 24, in verses 18 to 20. So chapter 24, verses 18 to 20. Swift are they on the face of the waters, their portion in the land is curse. No treader turns toward their vineyards. Drought and heat snatch away the snow waters. So does Sheol those who have sinned, Sheol being the place of the dead. The womb forgets them, the worm finds them sweet. They are no longer remembered, so wickedness is broken like a tree. So, particularly at the end, like wickedness is broken like a tree. The interesting part of that section is that sounds a lot like Job's friends. That sounds very much like the arguments they have made. And that's led some to believe that this particular section might actually be from one of the other friends that then, with edits later on in time, got somehow added to Job's speech. That's one idea. I mean, the other could be that I think for all of us, when we have such deeply held views, particularly our worldviews, like we've seen in this worldview that if you do bad things, you get punished. That's what Job's friends are holding on to. And Job at one time would have held something like that too. And so this may be him slipping into that idea because he's still... It's hard to get rid of a habit. It's hard to move past what you thought was the case. That could be the case with it too. I actually think that verse 24 in chapter 24 answers this a little bit. So here it reads, "They are exalted a little while, and then are gone. They wither and fade like the mallow. They are cut off like the heads of grain." So basically, the idea is, that the unjust succeed for a time maybe, but it's pointless since that time is short. So that at the end of it, the wicked are punished because they die and they don't get to succeed for that long. So that could be a way that he's sort of bridging his old view with his current one, or just trying to figure out what exactly is going on. But I think you can look at this passage in a lot of different ways, that it could be inserted into Job's speech later, or it could just be a natural part of Job's own speech and his own wrestling with what's going on. And then we turn from there to Bildad's third argument. And this is a very short section. It's chapter 25, but chapter 25 is only 6 verses. So the interesting part of this particular argument is he seems to agree somewhat with what Job has been saying. In fact, in verse 4 of chapter 25, he says, "How then can a mortal be righteous before God? How can one born of a woman be pure?" On one hand, that's getting back at the idea of, maybe you have sinned, Job. But on the other hand, it's also gets at Job's argument from earlier that it's hard for him to stand in front of God, because, how can you make your case before God? God can just smite you down if he wants to. And then, let's see. No, that was all I had for that section. Then we get into Job's response to Bildad, which goes from chapter 26 all the way to chapter 31. So I'm going to talk about this more in chunks. But the interesting bit is that he seems more favorable at the beginning to what Bildad has said. He doesn't, the first thing he says in verse 2 is, "How you have helped one who has no power." And again, this is in chapter 26, verse 2. So this is the first time he hasn't insulted one of his friends, so he seems to be finding some agreement. And this is a longer section, what's going on here. And part of that, some people think, and as you see later on, at the beginning of chapter 27, Job took up his discourse and said that there's some thoughts that there might have been more of Bildad's speech that got taken out, or maybe parts of Job's speech were originally supposed to be Bildad's, or something like that. And frankly, we just don't know. And this, as my professor, my Old Testament professor, Becky Wright, used to say, this is the text as we've received it, so this is what we got to deal with. But just going through kind of the main points that that Job has in his response to Bildad. First, looking at chapter 27, verse 5. "Far be it from me to say that you are right. Until I die, I will not put my integrity from me." So basically, he won't let go of his integrity until he has to. The idea that he's still innocent. Then we get in 28, for the whole chapter, where is wisdom to be found? Basically, where can we find wisdom? So that whole chapter is basically a poem about where is wisdom to be found. In 29, particularly in verses 11 through 20, in that section, Job starts giving his proof of his innocence, looking at his own actions, the good things that he's done, and then so again, it can't just be that he's done something wrong and God's punishing him, because what about all these other things? What's happening to Job doesn't match up with the old worldview, his old worldview, and the worldview that his friends still have. Let's see. In 29, we were just at. Now in chapter 30, so for all of chapter 30, we get that the tide is changed for Job once he was respected because of his wealth, because it seemed like, hey, like he's got all this stuff, so he must be a good guy. And now that he doesn't, he's reviled because people think, well, he must have done something wrong. He must have done something to deserve this. So basically this chapter is about how the tide has turned against Job, and now those who respected him do so no longer, that he's lost that respect he once had from people. And then the interesting part, I would say, in chapter 31, Job, for the whole thing, just as a summary, Job goes through and asks to be punished if he has sinned. The issue here isn't that he wouldn't take punishment if he deserved it. Like, he would do so very willingly. It's really that he doesn't know what he did. He maintains his innocence. And he really just wants to know what it was that happened, like what it was that led for these bad things to happen to him. Turning back again for a bit, now that we've kind of summarized most of it, 27 verses 7 through the end of 23. Again, we get this idea that the wicked get punished for doing bad things. So it seems to go back to his friend's argument, which again is a reason that people who look at this for a living think, oh, well, maybe this was really a section from Bildad or from Job's other friend Zophar, who we don't hear from in this third round. Maybe it was one of their arguments that then got inserted into Job. So whether it's that or, again, he's just lapsing into the old view, we don't really know. So then the very end for the poetry section we're going to be talking about in the next classes, the next segments of this, and that's his friend Elihu, and then God comes and makes his appearance, and Job responds to him as well. The thought with Elihu, we'll talk about it more next time, is that it might have been a later addition because he's not referred to in the prose section. He's also the much younger friend of Job and Job's other friends, so that's kind of gives an interesting look too at what's going on. So just some final notes as we end this. Again, Job is willing to take punishment. Like, that's not the issue. If he deserves a punishment, he's willing to take it, even to death. In fact, there are many sections of Job's speech, particularly early on, where he looks not just to die, but to just have never been born. He might even welcome that, even death. But so the issue isn't that he's not willing to take the punishment. He just wants to know what it was he did. He wants to know what it is that caused this to happen, if something caused it to happen. And maybe in part, too, so that, like his friends say, he can repent of it. Although I think it is important to note that Job does maintain that he's innocent, and I think if we look at the prose section, the divine conflict with the accuser being allowed by God and the heavenly court to inflict Job with all these bad things, I think we have to take Job at his word that he is actually innocent. Which then takes to the next point as we end. And this, again, kind of takes what Thomas Long says in What Shall We Say, his book on evil, suffering, and the crisis of faith, which is more geared towards preaching, but he has a section on Job in there, and as I've been reading more and more, I've been thinking that this is the right way to look at it, that Job's friends are looking at this old view of justice, which is not really right, and I actually think is not really consistent with what we get in Torah. I think when we see God saying, if you do these things, you will be prosperous in the promised land, I don't think he's saying, like, do good things happen, do bad things happen. I think what God is saying is, hey, like, I made the world, I know how this works. If you're good to each other, if you take care of the land, if you take care of each other, it's all going to work out. Like, it may make it harder at the start, but it'll all work out if you just do these things. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here, is that that is more of what the correct view of justice is it's not this, you do bad things, you get punished. Bad things are going to happen to people anyways. It's just how are we going to move forward together as a community. I think, though, too, even though his friends are looking at this old view of justice, I think it is important to note that they are trying to help. They're just doing a very bad job of it, and they're not being very, very supportive. What we also see is Job, because of his experience, is starting to see that this old view of justice doesn't work anymore. And so if we, and again, I think we should accept that Job is innocent, then a new view is needed for what's going on, for why bad things happen to people. And again, looking back at Long, and I do think he's right, he says that the whole book is a move from this old view to the new one, and that's at the end of the book, at the last part of the prose section. That's really what we see going on, and that's sort of symbolized in some ways, which we may or may not want to say, by Job getting back twofold what he had before. And as I said earlier, I think one of the things that we see missing from Job is something that we are fortunate to have, which is Jesus Christ. Which, I mean, I'm not saying that Job doesn't have a place in our tradition, because it does, and because it is dealing with the issue of pain and suffering before Jesus Christ came into the world, before the crucifixion and the resurrection, as worldly events happened. But I think that's something to keep in mind as we look at this book, because we do have that hope in our own faith that Job is lacking, and I think really needs at a lot of times. And then the last thing to add, there are some relevant issues here, I think, for our time now, in 2017, and before, and one would hope those listening in the future that they'll look at this and say, what are you talking about? But the first is that Job and his friends, they don't really seem to be listening to each other. They're kind of talking around each other. They're not really completely taking up. I mean, Job will take up some of the things they say, and they get more urgent as they're talking to him, and he's not accepting what they have to say. But their arguments, it's almost like they're thinking it through as they're going along alone, and just kind of, it's like a debate almost, that they're talking at each other. They're not listening to each other. So that's, I think, one good lesson for us today in the environment we're in now, is to try to listen, and not just to talk around each other. The other issue for our time is the so-called prosperity gospel. This is actually something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's a Lutheran pastor in World War II, who was part of the Valkyrie project to try to assassinate Hitler. He before the war, spent a lot of time in New York studying, and spent a lot of time particularly in Harlem, because he liked their soulful worship there better than this sort of prosperity gospel he'd get from a lot of, or the social gospel that he'd get from a lot of folks. But the prosperity gospel being this idea, this modern idea taking roots from other things, that if you're good and you do good things, your wealth will show it. So, and this is the view that they're taking a lot of times. It's in Job's friends that they're accepting this. So we still have this idea today in our world. And what we see in Job is that idea of the prosperity gospel doesn't actually hold water. It doesn't actually work. Just the last thing, the treatment of Job, I think, raises issues of victim shaming in our culture now, that it's the victim's fault for what's happening. Isn't it? Because that's essentially what his friends are saying, that this is your fault for what's happened to you now, and gets back at the question that's not raised, that, well, so if these people are doing bad things, what does that say about the victims? Are they supposed to suffer this, or are they suffering unjustly? If you say they're suffering unjustly, then that whole view of suffering means you've done something bad doesn't hold water. But I think that's something important for us to remember too, is that we still do some of these things. We still hold on to some of the views that Job's friends have. So we really need to take the time to listen to what Scripture has to offer us, to really see that, hey, maybe there's a better way, and maybe there's a better way because we've been struggling and dealing with these issues for a long time, and people have come up with alternative thoughts and solutions to things anyways. So that's all I've got for tonight. Our next class, once again, we'll go over Elihu's arguments against Job, and we'll go through that before we finish the poetry section with God's argument and Job's response to that. So thanks.